Hello, today I'm going to be giving some of my thoughts on the Pauper metagame in the form of a tier list. I'm going to be talking about all the decks and what I think their strengths and weaknesses are, and sort of get some general thoughts on the metagame. So I'm just going to be going from S tier down to F tier. Some of these decks aren't real decks, but this was sort of what's on the tier list. And then, sort of to preface this, I'm going to be talking about only for Magic Online specifically, because I mostly play Magic Online. So like Tron, I'm not even going to rank because I don't think the deck is playable on Magic Online. Like, there are a few people who play it, but I think that it's like the deck sort of loses to Weather the Storm and to Time Out a bit too often for me to be able to rank it accurately. And then I will say that this list is going to be super biased because I have played certain decks more. I like certain decks more, and there are going to be some decks that have really good results that I might put lower on the tier list just because I think that they're sort of overrated. So starting off, obviously Mono Red in S tier. I think that like the current version of Mono Red sort of has eaten up the old version of Mono Red with Kuldotha, because the current version runs the pingers, it runs the 8 impulse effects, and then it runs 4 End the Festivities and 4 Lava Dart, or maybe like 3 copies of those cards. But having those cards in your deck is extremely good when your opponent has Kuldotha Rebirth in their deck. So the current version of Mono Reds has sort of eaten up the meta space for the old version. But I think no matter what Mono Red deck, like Mono Red is very clearly the best deck. And whether or not you think it's the best deck, I definitely think it's going to be the most popular deck and the deck you need to prepare for the most. And then that's the only deck I'm going to have in S tier. And then below that I'm going to have Affinity. Affinity definitely feels a lot worse than it did like 6 months ago. I'd say like 6 months ago, Affinity was pretty clearly the best deck and had very few bad matchups. Like, your sideboard was able to cover basically everything, but these days the Affinity deck has to dedicate so much space to beating the red deck that it sort of lost a lot of ground versus the like white decks with Dust to Dust. So like the Affinity deck, it's harder for them to main deck multiple copies of Metallic Rebuke, which is one of the best ways to fight the Dust to Dust decks. And because the Affinity deck isn't able to play that card as much, sort of they're weaker to other sideboard hate. With that being said, it's still a very, very strong deck, and sort of has game in basically every matchup. Next, I'm going to put Familiars as the third best deck. This is probably not accurate, but I feel like if more people picked up Familiars and played the deck at the highest level, you would see it basically like be half of, like, maybe not half of every top 8, but you'd see a couple copies in every top 8, I think, if more people played the deck proficiently. I think that the really only weakness for Familiars is Ponza and maybe like Blitz. But past that, I think the deck is really hard to hate out. Like just trying to play a bunch of relics in your sideboard to try to hate on Familiars isn't a super effective plan. And so you really have to change decks to try to beat Familiars. You can't just like throw a pile of cards in your sideboard and hope to beat the good Familiars players, because it's just not going to work. The next deck I have here is Mono Blue. I think Mono Blue is like super overrated, to be honest. I think the deck is somewhat inconsistent. It has pretty low card quality. Like the fact that the deck has to play like Brine Barrow Intruder or like Cyber Cryptomancer or like Smoke Shroud, like all these cards are just super low power level. And so you'll get into games where your synergy is broken up and you have all these like really crappy draft commons that just don't line up super well. With that being said, like you get a lot of free wins with Mono Blue, which is always nice. Like if you have a hand with like a Snap, Mutagenic Growth, a Ninja, and a Fairy, you can sometimes just get like completely free wins, especially if you win the die roll. And I'd say like if you want to, any deck, like I think all 4 of these decks, if you win the die roll, are just like really, really, really favored against the rest of the field. And let's see, what's my next deck? Next deck is Blue Black Terror. I think this deck is also super overrated. I think that the problem with the Terror deck is that there are a lot of games where you don't draw the card Brainstorm, and it means that you are playing all these crappy mill 2 draw card spells, And because you're playing so much draw with not enough selection, you're going to end up flooding out, or you're going to end up drawing the wrong half of your deck. You're going to draw like a bunch of counterspells and no creatures, a bunch of creatures and no counterspells, and you really need to draw like a nice mix of creatures, counterspells, removal spells, and ideally like a copy of Unexpected Fangs or something to fight the red deck. And I think that because you only get to run 4 copies of Brainstorm, the deck is just slightly too inconsistent. I still have it up in A tier because it gets results, but I think the deck is kind of overrated. The next deck I have here is Naya Gates. I could have put this in A tier, but I think the deck just doesn't have results recently. I think the deck is super underplayed, and is super consistent, and has game against basically all these decks. I'd say probably favored against all the decks up here, except for Familiars, where it's very much unfavored. But against Mono Red, you have Strands. Against Affinity, you have a nice sideboard plan. Against Familiars, you just lose. Against Mono Blue, I think you're pretty favored with Strands and Red Blast in the sideboard, and obviously Squadron Hawk. And then against Blue Black, it's probably closer to even, but I think that if you play smart, a lot of their sweepers end up just becoming 1-for-1s, and you can sort of make their deck super clunky. And I think the matchups against all the top decks are pretty good, so that's why I'm going to have it B tier, even though it doesn't put up many results. All right, next deck in B tier, I'm going to have Black-White Ephemerate. I think Black-White Ephemerate is also somewhat overrated because the matchup against Red is not as good as I think most people will say it is. And also the matchup against Affinity is also not as good as most people say it is. But obviously the Monarch or the Initiative is broken, and if you can actually hit all your first 5 land drops, if you can go like Thraben Inspector, removal spell, removal spell, removal spell into turn 5 Goliath Paladin, you're just gonna beat like 80% of the metagame just by casting Initiative on turn 5 and then maybe flickering it on turn 6. And so I don't know. I think Black-White is a playable deck for sure. Maybe not broken or anything, probably overplayed, but still a decent option. The next deck, let's see, where is it at? Is Walls. I think Walls is pretty underrated. I think the deck struggles against Affinity really hard. I don't think the matchup is as bad as other people say it is. It's pretty common where they'll draw Crookland Shaman and then you'll make them activate it like super early on in the game, and it'll cost them all their lands. And then at that point, like, you can sort of rebuild. Although sometimes you'll just lose to Affinity. I think the Affinity matchup is obviously terrible, but I don't think it's quite as bad as others say it is. I think the matchup against Red is probably 50-50 or slightly unfavored. But then the matchups against Familiars, Mono Blue is probably 50-50, Blue Black is probably 50-50. And then like all these random mid-range decks like Naya Gates, and the Initiative piles, and then basically everything down here, you're going to be pretty favored against, I think, as Walls. Basically, if you expect a wider metagame, Walls is probably a good idea, but if you expect just to face against these top decks, it's not going to be very strong. Next, I have this Avenging Hunter, which I'm going to assume is mono black control with splashing green for the Avenging Hunter, and the Colony Garden. I think the deck is actually not too bad. The piles I've seen that run like some number of Crypt Rats, some number of Deadly Disputes, a bunch of removal spells, and then it's basically just a pile of removal and then an initiative, sort of like the old mono black control decks where you had a pile of removal spells and then Monarch. I think the deck is actually somewhat decent. It has game against basically everything. It doesn't have, except for Affinity, I think, up here. But I think it's probably not, like, usually you can do better than picking mono black if you wanted to, I guess this is Golgari mid-range, the Golgari control deck. I think you can probably do better than picking this deck, but it's not a terrible option. So next I have Ponza. I think Ponza is like, okay. It's really good against Familiars, and it's really good against some of the other decks like Tron and stuff. But you basically can never beat Walls. You're pretty unfavored against Mono Red, although it's actually closer than I think people would expect. But I think you generally are losing to Mono Red, Affinity, Mono Blue, and Blue Black. if not by a lot, you're losing at least by just a little bit to those 4 decks. And so I'll put it in B tier. And I think the deck is like it's playable, but it's a bit inconsistent. It's pretty hard to open a hand that has mana, a payoff, and land destruction all at once. And you end up mulliganing a lot. You'll like mulligan to 5, and your 5-card hand will be like super slow. And I think the deck is just a little bit too inconsistent to be higher than this. Next I have Blitz. I think Blitz is a fine deck, but the issue with Blitz is that you just lose to the other mono red deck because you're basically playing the same deck, except for you have a bunch of pump spells in your deck and they don't. So they're just going to burn all your creatures down, and then you're stuck with a bunch of pump spells in your hand, and then they're just going to murder you. Still, you can kill people on turn 3 or whatever. It's kind of cool. Maybe people enjoy that. I feel like it's not that great, but put that there. Next, I have Bogles. I think Bogles is decent. You're decent against mono blue. I think you're pretty unfavored against Affinity. You're probably 50-50 against Familiars. Probably unfavored against blue-black. And definitely super favored against mono-red. Barring like some raise shenanigans, I think it's pretty hard to lose against mono-red if you have a reasonable draw. And especially when you have the 4 Falcons in the sideboard. If you can just get like any enchantment and then give it lifelink, you're probably just going to be able to beat most of the mono-red draws. Okay, next I have Naya Gates, or all the different 4-color Gates piles. I think these are fine. I think that they end up being worse than Cog-Gates a lot of the time, just because you don't have access to cantrips and you don't have access to the Modern Age, which means that you end up flooding out a lot. And also these decks, like, they often play cards like Core Skyfisher and Ephemerate, and they're not, I don't think, accurately built to support those cards. So like you'll have Core Skyfisher, and if you don't draw like Thraben Inspector or Gate Creeper Vine, it's just a really awkward 2/3 for 2 mana, and you like have to bounce a land. I don't know. I think the deck is decent against red and has like an okay mid-range plan, but I think it just ends up being lower consistency than Cog-Gates, and so I have it lower down here. This is old mono black. Let's see, where do I want to go? I guess next tier, I'm going to put the 2 Fairies decks in C tier, the multicolored Fairies decks. These used to be, I think, the best 2 decks in the format, or maybe blue-black was the best and Infinity was the second best, but they've definitely fallen down a lot. I think I'm going to put blue-black higher. I think they're both pretty bad against mono-red right now. I think blue-black has slightly better odds against mono-red, because you can play like maybe an Unexpected Fangs in the sideboard. But you do have 4 Snuffouts in your deck, which is really, really not very good against mono-red, so that's why I have the decks kind of down here. I think they're okay versus like these 3 decks here, and they're okay versus all this stuff down here, but you're just going to lose super hard to Affinity and mono-red, I think. Maybe not super hard to mono-red, but you're gonna lose to Affinity with both these decks, I think, most of the time. Less so with blue-red, but it used to be that I think the Fairies decks just had good matchups against every deck, and I don't think that's true anymore. Alright, next I have the 2 other Flicker decks. Where are they at? Jeskai and Tron. So I think Jeskai, Ephemerate, and Tron are sort of have a similar metagame spot where they're Flicker decks that are better. Like, they have more powerful mana engines than the Familiars deck, because it's harder to interact with the mana engines because their mana engines are lands, and they also win heads up against Familiars. I think both of these decks are favored against Familiars heads up, but the problem is that you just lose to mono red super hard, whereas Familiars gets access to Prismatic Strands if they want it, and mostly Godfar's Faithful and a bunch of cheaper interaction. Tron, I think, just dies before they get Tron online sometimes against mono red, and then Jeskai like has a bunch of tap lands, and like Jeskai just isn't a very good counterspell deck, even though they have 4 counterspells in their deck. Like, they just play too many tap lands, and they play a bunch of basic mountains and some basic, I think, like a basic plains, and they just can't cast their spells on time a lot of the time. Whereas with Familiars, you can go like Familiars, snap, and then play something, and be much faster than the Jeskai deck. All right, next I have White Weenie. I think White Weenie is a playable deck, but definitely not a great deck. I think it's just a bit underpowered. Like, if you curve out perfectly every game, you would win like a large percentage of your games, but you're playing mono white, so like you have to keep some awkward 2-landers and then you never hit your 3rd land and you die, or you keep some like awkward 4-lander and then you only draw lands and you die. And I don't know, I think the deck is just a touch too inconsistent. Like, I get the reason for playing this deck is you have all untapped lands and you have a nice beatdown plan, and then you get Dust to Dust out of the sideboard, and you have a decent game against mono red because your creatures are all bigger than theirs. But I think after playing this deck a bit, it's just way too inconsistent to be a contender, in my opinion. All right, next I have Turbofog. I think Turbofog is fine. I don't know. I feel like this deck is overplayed a bit, just because in theory it's good against mono red and it's good against blue black, but it's bad against Affinity, it's very bad against Familiars, and it's very bad against mono blue. At least I would imagine. I haven't played that matchup a lot, but basically there are too many decks that are either don't care about your life total or are just a pile of counterspells, and you're just never going to beat those decks as Turbofog. So I think probably it's not a great option. Next I have the 2 synthesizer mid-range decks, though I have Mardu Synth and Boro Synth. I think, I don't know how I'd order these, but I think they're both pretty bad. I think like the way that these decks end up playing out is that you end up accruing a bunch of value by playing birds and picking up artifacts and replaying the artifacts, and you just have so much card draw but no card selection, so you just end up flooding out like every single game. Every single game you either get stuck on 3 lands and you have to spend a bunch of mana replaying these rocks to draw a single card, or you just end up drawing like 7 lands in a row and you have no cantrips in your deck, like no card selection, you don't have preordain or anything. And so I think these decks just end up being not nearly consistent enough, and also probably end up being too slow, especially the 3-color version against mono red, because you're just playing a bunch of tap lands. All right, next I have Hogwarts. Hogwarts is certainly a deck. I think it was decent at some point. The issue with Hogwarts is that you can interact in like every conceivable way. So if you have creature removal, you can interact. If you have counterspells, you can interact. And if you have graveyard hate, you can also interact. And so basically every deck just has like a pile of sideboard cards they can bring in against this deck, even though they aren't trying to metagame against Hogwarts. They just happen to have a bunch of sideboard cards for it. And even in the matchups where you think this deck would be good, like against like Familiars or, I don't know, Naya Gates, I guess, would be another theoretically good matchup. They just have like a pile of blue blasts in their sideboard, and then you just like draw 3 copies of the same combo piece, and yeah, the deck is just not consistent enough, and it's really bad. Like you just fold to makeshift munitions if you don't draw. You have to draw into your a removal spell for the makeshift munitions, which ends up being really awkward. And against mono red, it seems like there's no hope in that matchup. They just have way too much removal to be for you to be able to get out your combo. All right, next is Madness. Madness is a deck that I think ends up being too slow, too inconsistent compared to the actual burn deck. It used to be that the Madness deck was better than mono red because you had a nice card advantage engine with like the looting and the blood tokens and stuff. But now mono red with the 8 impulses has an actual card advantage engine. There's just really no reason to play this Madness deck. All right, now I just have a bunch of random decks that are not very playable. So I have Stompy, Slivers, Elves, Mono Whites, Cycle Storm. So I guess I'll go over these. These are basically just like random creature decks. Well, let's start with these 4. These are 4 basically just random creature decks that all died to either Affinity or Mono Red. And I think there's kind of no solving the problem of... I guess I'll start with these 3. These 3 all die to Affinity Mono Red, and there's no real way to solve that for these decks. As far as Heroic goes, Heroic is just bad. Like you're playing a mono white deck, and you just lose to Cast Down, you lose to Snap, you lose to Snuff Out, you lose to basically anything imaginable. If your opponent interacts with you at all, you're just not going to win, and you don't actually have a nice like. This deck is just not good. And then Cycle Storm, I think Cycle Storm is a playable deck, I guess, but everybody has Graveyard Hate because they think it's good against Familiars and they think it's good against blue-black. And so you sort of get caught in the crossfire there. And also the deck has just not gotten any new cards since Modern Horizons 2. And like basically all the other good decks have gotten cards since Modern Horizons 2. And so the deck is just sort of like way too slow. And then let's see. F tier, I have Mono Black Devotion, Tireless Tribe, and Boros Bully. Boros Bully, I think, is just worse than Mono White because it's too slow. Like you have a better consistency because you have Faithless Looting, and you have better a better card advantage engine with Squadron Hawk, and you can looting the Hawks away rather than like just playing them out as 1/1s. It's sort of you can loot them away sort of in Mono White, but I think Bully has a slightly better card advantage engine, but it just ends up being too slow against like any of the actual top decks. And also because Arms of Hadar is a magic card, like if your opponent, if this deck is ever good, people just put like 2 copies of Arms of Hadar into their sideboard and then just completely hose you. Whereas it used to be like Black only had access to 1-damage sleepers, so you could play like a Parapet or I forget the name of the white enchantment that has morph. You could play basically enchantments that would buff your toughness, and you'd be insulated against sweepers, but I don't think that's true anymore now that Arms of Hadar is a magic card. And then Tireless Tribe just sucks, it loses to removal, Mono Red has piles of removal, and then Mono Black Devotion also sucks because it's an old deck that hasn't been... it basically just doesn't have any new cards. I think the new version of Mono Black is actually totally fine, but this deck is sort of a meme at this point. And then I'm not going to rank Tron just because it's not playable on Magic Online in my opinion. I can't get this off the tier, but yeah. All right, well, I'm going to be streaming tomorrow. I'm going to be streaming the challenge, so if you want to watch me, I'll put the Twitch link in the description, and otherwise, thank you for watching.